Thanks to you and to Burroughs Audubon for inviting us to talk and hosting this meeting. It was an absolute honor to be able to work on this paper with Marky and Mark, and I'm so excited to be able to bring you the results of it. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marky and let her take you through it.
Thank you both so much. Yeah, this project was inspired by a Limpkin that was specifically in the Kansas City area. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and bring our PowerPoint in. Alrighty, it should be shared now. So hopefully people can see that on their screen. All right, good. Sweet. So I sort of mentioned that it was inspired by a bird in Kansas City. And through Mary asking me, why do you think these birds are showing up? And we watched this specific bird near Kansas City. This really wonderful project was sort of born. We were able to see what we could do with citizen science data and sort of our hands in other fields of work like museum research. We were able to put together something pretty dang cool. So the title of our paper and also right now for the talk are Patterns in Demography of Limpkin Vagrancy in the 21st Century United States. So I'll go ahead and take you through it. So probably everyone here is familiar with the Limpkins at this point. But I think that more than just these birds being these funky swamp inhabitants that look kind of like a rail, I wanted to, of course, bring a little bit of my evolutionary biology background and just kind of give you an idea of how unique these birds are. So if we look at, this is an evolutionary tree, a phylogeny, and the orange branch is where the limpkin is. Its closest relative is actually cranes. So despite looking kind of like an ibis or a rail, it is separated by more than 50 million years from ibises and rails. So this bird is in its own family. Limpkins, honestly, are just really their own thing. So despite looking similar, it's really cool that these guys are evolutionarily adapted the way that they are. And so I think before 2021, 2022, limpkins were always thought of as that really cool swamp bird that you go to Florida to see. They're distributed throughout the Neotropics, so South America, Central America, the Caribbean, but they really only historically have been in Florida in terms of looking at distribution across the United States. Historically, they also reached parts of Georgia and southern Mississippi. There's a couple records from South Carolina, but they're almost entirely contained to the state of Florida. And so um, it has mostly been thought that this is because they are so attached to swamps, but it's probably also due to the fact that, as I mentioned, their evolutionary history, there's a lot of parts of them that are specifically fine-tuned for how they feed and how they breed. And so these guys, what makes Florida so special for these guys is that the only native apple snail in the region was this Florida apple snail. And I'll be calling these apple snails by their genus name, which is Pomacia. And so the range of these native apple snails has really only been confined to Florida. And so it's likely the fact that these limpkins probably had a neotropical origin. And as they've sort of spread, they've been able to take advantage of these different snail populations. So they came to the US and they realized that Florida really only has the apple snail for me. So they stayed in Florida. Of course, as we know, sort of a hint at this incredible event that we've seen with this vagrancy, they're also opportunistic. They eat mussel species and other invertebrates. But overall, their breeding range is really tied to these apple snails or Pomacia.
Hmm.
And so, what happens when we bring a different species of apple snail to the US and that apple snail spreads? Well, it seems like the limpkins follow. So in Florida in 1994, the first non-native apple snail were documented. And just in 2005, they were already in Georgia. And so if you actually look down here in the bottom of the slide, this is showing the non-native apple snail, which is called Pomacia maculata. They sort of started in Florida. There's a couple isolated spots in the Gulf Coast, but just a little bit more than a decade later, now present day, we see them across the entire Gulf Coast, especially with concentrations near Houston, across southern Louisiana, really sort of that I-10 corridor in south, and of course, all over Florida. Interestingly, this explosion of non-native snails in Florida also seems to correspond to an explosion of limpkins in Florida as well. With Christmas bird count data in the early 90s, there are probably less than 2 limpkins on average per Christmas bird count circle. Whereas in 2017, where there are definitely a lot of these non-native apple snails now, we're seeing an average of 37 limpkins per circle. So it seems like even though we have originally apple snails in Florida, the non-native ones have really helped limpkins boost their numbers. And so, of course, with the spread of these non-native apple snails, we also see breeding records showing up in Louisiana in 2018 and Texas following suit in 2021. And so when we think about these vagrancy events, sort of what drove Mary and I, and also Mark, to look at these birds was thinking about what have they done in the past. There are historical records of limpkins showing up way out of range, but it's really been like isolated one-offs. And so we dug into the literature and we found a couple things related to something called post-breeding dispersal. So this is something where after the breeding season, a lot of the young birds sort of disperse from their parental territories. This is why things like wood storks and roseate spoonbills sometimes show up in Missouri as well. So limpkins, they also do post-breeding dispersal. We do find these juvenile birds, and sometimes female birds will leave their breeding area. And they actually form these large flocks in the fall sometimes, upwards of over 100 birds. Oftentimes, this has been seen in Florida. We also found that in more parts of their neotropical distribution in like South America, several books usually have like a one-off sentence noting, oh, when there's flooding or there's extreme drought, these limpkins suddenly disappear from the landscape. And this likely has to do with them being tied to their food. And so apple snails also need a specific water level in order to reproduce and thrive. So it's likely that these birds are attached to the foraging levels, the water levels, as well as the survival of these snails. And so this led to this incredible explosion of Limpkin records in the late 2010s and early 2020s. Of course, we're seeing things in Louisiana and Texas showing up, but very quickly after, suddenly there was this huge explosion of birds across the entire eastern United States. We had records in Colorado, for example. We had records in Ontario, and hundreds of birds just showing up everywhere. It was sort of this mass mayhem. And so um, there was this bird in Kansas City that showed up, and unfortunately, it passed away. And it was taken to the museum at KU. And Mary and I were looking over this bird, and we noticed there were some funky things going on with its feathers. And we were really thinking, how can we tie previous knowledge of these birds with new knowledge based on this incredible event and to kind of figure out what happened and why these birds did what they did. So just a nod to something hot Limpkin summer. Um, but we'll go into this a little bit more. So this is a map from our paper that will be linked, showing sort of the incredible number of birds that moved. So all these little points on this map are individual Limpkin records, and this is spanning from 2000 to 2020. And so, of course, yes, there are records in Florida from the early 2000s. They're still there, but this is just showing how rapidly these birds moved. And so you can see there's a couple sort of lighter yellowish color down here in Louisiana. Those are those first breeding records. They popped over to Texas, and now we just have this explosion in the last few years. So we looked at things like the pattern of these birds showing up. We also looked at the timing of when these birds showed up. And so from 2020 to 2024, this is back we were working with data before the publishing process, which takes a few months to get through. But this is just sort of a heat map, or I guess, depending on what colors you want to call it, a cool map, showing that our darker colors are when more limpkins show up, and our lighter colors are when fewer limpkins showed up, sort of north of the Gulf Coast region. So it seems like 2023, which was our huge year of limpkins, we really see a peak number in August and September. And you might also be asking, why is there one sort of like greenish tile in 2024, those are likely holdover records that made it through the winter of 2023 rather than new birds showing up. So it seems like summer really is the time for these birds to engage in this vagrancy event. So now that we had the timing, we had the distribution of points, we were also inspired, like I said, by that museum salvaged bird by aging these birds and maybe even sexing them to see if there is some dominant group that is moving. And so we also tied this in with drought and flooding because of those previous things, but we were really interested in the aging. And so we went through and aged them. I'll go ahead and give you guys a little 101 on how we aged all these birds here in a second. But just to give you a big overview, we were looking for these big patterns and we found something very surprising. So using Macaulay Library, we were able to scour through images and looking at all the birds that you guys reported from the state and other states. And we were actually able to go through and look at your images and age these birds. And so based off of the thought of like post-breeding dispersal, like what I talked about earlier, where we have a lot of young birds moving, we were thinking, oh, maybe it's a lot of young birds. Or if we think about the snowy owls, when they have a huge breeding success and we have all these birds coming south, oftentimes it's juvenile birds. And so we were thinking, well, this is probably something where it's like a breeding success or a post-breeding dispersal. So we expected juvenile birds. Well, that was not the case. Of the 72 individual birds we were able to actually age, 69 of them were adult birds, and only 3 birds in total across this big movement were actually juvenile birds. So this is really exciting. So now to take you into how we actually age them, so we can give you a little crash course, we're going to step through all these really cool ages of limpkins, because there's a lot of really cool things that you can do with limpkins. So the first really cool thing about these birds is that they have a modified outer primary, or what we call P10. Um, and in the young limpkins, their feather, so this is the feather being shown on the left part of the screen, their outermost primary, it's shorter, of course, but it looks like a pretty normal feather. Well, if we look at the adult outer primary shown on the right, it's kind of got this weird curve shape or kind of like a scythe shape, and this is what we call spatulate. And so uh, the really cool thing about limpkins is that this primary shape isn't just to look cool, it actually makes a noise. It makes a buzzing noise when these birds flap during their displays. And so it makes sense that sexually mature adult birds would have this, but the juvenile birds don't need to invest energy into making these special feathers just yet. Another thing that's really great about this is that even when the limpkin's wings are folded and they're just hanging out sitting down, we can actually age them as adult or juvenile birds from photos. So even if you don't get a photo of the bird's full wing in flight, oftentimes we can still pull this really cool, valuable age-related data from photos that you upload to like eBird. Now, of course, we can also get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty and age these birds to their year. And so another really cool thing about limpkins, so in addition to being in their own family, in addition to having a modified bill for eating snails in a very specific way, and having these interesting interactions between environment and their movements, they also have kind of a backwards molt. So if you've ever worked with molt in birds or studied molt or banded birds, oftentimes birds molt from our inner primary P1 and they go outwards towards P10. Well, limpkins, they do it opposite. They start at P10 and they go inwards. So if we think about how molt proceeds, we can start over here on the left with our juvenile birds. And if you think about it, these birds, they breed in like February and March, the young hatch, and then they have to grow in all their feathers at once. So we end up with one generation of feathers across their wings. So this is the juvenile wing. We can see they all have the same shade of brown from P1 to P10. They're all very uniform. And overall, we only had, like I said, 3 individuals that showed this pattern. Our most dominant group of all these aged limpkins were what we call second year birds. So if we think about it in terms of life history of these birds, because molt terminology can get kind of confusing pretty fast. So a limpkin, it hatches in April, May, June. It goes through its first summer and fall, and then winter comes, and that's starting to be the breeding season, and these birds start to gain their adult plumage. And so they'll start molting their outer primaries, because if they molt that outer primary, they can now make that buzzing noise to attract a mate. And so this is when they enter their second year. And so you can see here on the right, this is a second year bird, and you can see how P1 through P6 in those inner primaries are light brown, which are their juvenile feathers. And then P7 through P10 are this dark brown because they're fresh feathers. They haven't been exposed to the sun as much. They're nice and new. And so this bird is a second year, and this is now an adult bird. And so this again is the majority of the birds that we saw through our aging that make up the demographics of these incredible vagrancy events. We can also take it past that though. So we can look at them into their third year even. And so this is when they, of course, have three generations of feathers. And so unlike, again, passerine birds or songbirds, they typically molt all their primaries in one go. It may take them a few weeks, but they usually start with those inner primaries and molt all the way out, and they're good to go. Well, the limpkins, they molt a couple groups at a time. And so this is how we end up with many ages of feathers across one wing. So if you look closely here, we can see there's really light brown colored P1, P2, P3. Those are still that bird's juvenile feathers. Then P4, P5, all the way up through P8 are a slightly darker brown. Those are from its second year. And then P9 and P10 are these brand new feathers for the breeding season once more. And so this makes this bird in its third year. And we had one individual that we were able to age at this level. However, we can go one step further after their third year, or at least minimum their fourth year. Once you get to 4 ages of feathers across their wings, they could be in their 5th year and have 4 ages. They could be in their 6th year and have 4 ages. So it seems like they can really maximum hold 4 ages of feathers across their primaries. So this is why we call it minimum 4th year. And you can see here in this image on the left, we do have kind of at least sort of 4 different colors of brown happening across the wings. And once again, you can see P10 has this really funky shape. So this is really exciting. We're able to see that not extremely young birds are moving. Birds in their first breeding cycle are moving. And then adult birds that probably have established territories in the Gulf are moving as well, but it's a very low number, but still more than juvenile birds, which is quite interesting. So, oops. In addition to aging based on photos, we were also able to take advantage of a really unique resource with museum birds. And so if you know anything about museums and how they catalog their records, when these birds are donated, so typically these were limpkins that passed away due to the cold weather across all over the northern United States. They're brought to museums, and then typically those birds either sit in a freezer for a while because you don't have very many people to prepare them for specimens, or if they prepare them, they take time to catalog these records, and eventually they get put into an online database that you can access. However, this can take years, and it can be really hard to track down recent events. And so Mary and I and Mark, we were reaching out to all these different museums. We were looking on eBird, and we were like, oh my gosh, that person noted that this bird passed away and they donated it. So I'm going to reach out to that museum. And so we had to do a lot of like sleuthing to figure out different things. There were like local newspapers that we found notes about what museums these birds are going to. And so we're actually able to reach out to these incredible museums and get some information from them, which was amazing and took a lot of work and time. But we were really excited because turns out the sex ratio of these vagrant birds was pretty much exactly 1-to-1. It wasn't males or females moving more than one or the other. We were also able to pull certain age data from these birds, and we found almost all of them were second year birds. We did have one. We were just sent a photo of the outer primary, and we were like, yep, that's an adult bird. Unfortunately, a lot of these birds aren't prepared with their wings open, so we can't always age them. And certain museums didn't have photos or time to send us that information. But we found overwhelmingly from the birds that we did get age data from, they continued to follow the trend that we saw from pulling photos that they were second year birds or overall adult birds. Here is a map showing sort of the distribution. There's a lot of different shapes and things going on here, but I just want you to focus on the color. So black points are adult birds that we aged from photos, and then the gray points are the juveniles, and those juveniles are located like near Chicago, down in Tennessee, and then over in Pennsylvania. And so you can see once again, we have a lot of adult birds that we age. So this is just sort of reiterating that point. These birds in their first breeding season are the ones that really participated in this incredible vagrancy event. So paired with this distribution, paired with being able to look into the aging and sexing of these birds, we can start to put together some theories about why these birds moved. And so one of the first ones, like I mentioned with post-breeding dispersal, we have natal dispersal. The parents kick the young out. We would expect to see juveniles in that like August, September, October, but we're not. We're seeing second year birds after their first breeding season. So they've gone through their first summer as juvenile birds. They go into their breeding season in January, February, March. They finish their breeding season and then they show up in August and September and October in places like Missouri. So it's really interesting to see these birds after their first year showing up, not juveniles. What about breeding success? Well, like I mentioned with snowy owls, we're also not seeing juvenile birds moving. It's these adult birds after their first breeding season. So what about delayed breeding success? Well, this could be one reason. Maybe we had a boom of limpkins and then those juvenile birds went looking for their first territory, and maybe they didn't do so well. And they just kind of floundered around in the Gulf Coast in these swamps looking for territories during the first breeding season, but they didn't find anything. And so we have this huge amount of these young adult birds with no territories. So the next fall and early winter, they're like, I'm going to go look elsewhere. So maybe that's why they're showing up in these crazy places. We can also think about their expansion into these new areas. So if we have birds that have lived in Florida their entire time and now they're following these snails and they're going westwards into the Gulf Coast, well, they're experiencing whole new conditions. Even though the Gulf Coast is very humid and warm, places like Texas and Louisiana experience more fluctuation in temperature than Florida does. Florida, surrounded by ocean, on either side, is a more stable environment. Uh, I lived in Louisiana for a little while, and we actually had snow that showed up down in Baton Rouge a couple times, which is quite crazy. So these birds, they're moving into these new environments, they're experiencing more fluctuations. Maybe they need to move a little bit more or react to these climatic differences a little bit differently. Um, and the big thing that we were finding, even in more historical movements, is that drought and flood, especially drought, seems to sort of initiate these movements. It's not a perfect relationship, but we found that if we have drought in Florida, we were seeing movement out of Florida. But with these big movements, there weren't really huge drought conditions in Florida happening. But when we look at Louisiana and Texas, there were. And so it might be that these new populations are experiencing these drought conditions, and they are the ones that are causing this mass exodus further north. And so all of this was driven through our own questions, but we were really able to wrangle this using eBird. We were able to sit down and request data from eBird, and they sent it to us, and we were able to do our own plotting of our maps and looking at timing and pulling all this age data. And so it's truly a remarkable resource. Of course, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with eBird, but please keep using it. It's amazing to have access to this type of data. Of course, uploading your photos. Macaulay just did an update where you can upload things other than birds too. So if you see really cool things like frogs or bats, you can upload that. We can look at prey items that limpkins eat through photos, which is really cool. We, of course, can age limpkins. But any cool thing that happens, it's great to document it because people do use it. Additionally, museums are super important. I feel like they can be a bit of a controversial topic, but this is a great place to bring these unfortunate events where maybe a limpkin, for example, passes away. We can actually give that to a museum and they will be used for scientific purposes. So please, if you see a bird pass away, or you find one, please go ahead and reach out to your local museums. At the very least, if you reach out to a small local museum, they might be able to put you in contact with someone else, and help you out with that. This again allows us to age and sex these vagrant limpkins, which is really cool going into the future. Hopefully, our work will inspire people to look a little bit more at this bird. Despite limpkins being this really unique bird on its own evolutionary trajectory, not very closely related to anything else, there's not really been that much work done. There's only a couple people out there who've studied limpkins, and so this was sort of us wading into this brand new territory. It was a really exciting project. And so we're hoping to inspire people to look into limpkins a little bit more, maybe even track limpkins. Maybe we could tag some birds in the Gulf Coast and see if they disperse. There's a lot of really cool things going on with these birds that we don't know. Um, so Thank you all so much for this fun little talk. If you want to get to know more about all the work that we did, there is going to be that link to the paper. It is open access for the next 6 or so months. So it's nice and free for you to read, and look at all our figures and work that we did. So with that, I think it's time for questions.
Um,